I have to talk about Europe because it has a special place in my heart, I would say, because um, of the time that I do have, um, just in general. I can't help but just spend time studying its history, which can be said for most places of Earth, but Europe especially, because it has a particular sort of history that's just extra interesting to me personally. And that's weird because, like, when I was in school, you couldn't get me to care about anything remotely like that if you paid me to. So one of the more interesting things about Europe was the fact that it had a renaissance. The fact that that's even possible to have something sweep across a continent like that, and how changing that was. The very definition, the very idea of a renaissance has to involve a people who recorded history. You really can't have a renaissance without that. Because the renaissance was heavily based off of a rediscovery of Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy, Roman history, Greek history, all that. And when I was younger, I didn't know Aristotle and Plato were even alive at the same time, let alone the fact that Aristotle was Plato's mentor. And there are more examples of situations like that. Like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were not only alive at the same time, but they were rivals. I thought they were just kind of separate, famous artists and philosophers, but they were actually alive at the same time, in contact with each other, and hated each other. But those are two different pairs of people, separated by hundreds of years, who had such a massive influence on Europe and the Western world, but they were alive at the same time. And they were heavily tied together. And one of those two pairs was part of the Renaissance, and the other of those two pairs was the genesis of where the Renaissance even came from. So you could say that the four of them are connected, which is true. And Europe, in my opinion, is sort of the center of deep political and societal examinations, and even philosophy and science, and really everything of the modern world came from Europe. And for me personally, like, I want the United States to dominate the world. That's what I want, because I'm an American, and I want the power of the world to have to at least be signed off by the United States. But at the same time, I want every other country to want the same thing for themselves. I want China to want that too, and Europe collectively to want that too. I don't want you to just give up and say you do it. Well, why would you do that? That's to me, that sort of thinking. It's like, I view the male leaders of Europe like, I don't even know what they are. It's hard for me to even classify them as such. Like, I just view them as like genderless entities that have a patch of skin where their dick and balls should be. It's like it's completely lacking in thrust and anything of virtue. And the irony is that it wants to be virtuous. It wants to be a place of highness and virtue and morality, but it is none of those things. It just isn't anymore. It's like a sad husk, sort of living museum for the rest of us to sort of look at and dissect and say, well, what went wrong? Why are you guys in a deep psychological depression? This is what it looks like to have a psychological depression for an entire continent. I mean, and there are exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, the whole continent is depressed. It's depressing. At least that's what it looks like when you consider it in this sort of Game of Thrones style era where each country has their own sort of main character who is the will of their entire people. And, we have this cast of characters right now. And at least for the United States, say what you want. But the dude at the helm, you can be sure that he is on our behalf, for the people of the territory for which he was elected, which is a good place to start, at least, in these times, in a more globalized world where your alliances and your motivation can be more splintered and even less certain and less direct. I mean, who does your leadership work for? What is their primary aim on a day-to-day basis? Do you know? I mean, I think it's an utter failure of a democratic system when it ends up electing people who hate the population, or at least have disgust or disdain for them and the territory. It's an utter failure, and it's a problem for sure. It's an issue because that has happened more than once, and it may continue to happen until people kind of get it, that it's even possible for that to happen. I think because people don't want to believe that, but it's okay to vote for somebody who ends up in office, who ends up being just a complete shithole as a person and a leader, and it's okay to admit that. It's not the end of the world. It's better to recognize the truth and say it and know it than continue to persist in a distortion of the truth. Because similar to how 1 degree of direction can get you hundreds of millions of miles off in time, one little distortion allowed to persist can spread into other areas and cause a complete delusion to fester and exist and grow and even spread to other people, especially this day and age, and that's not what you want, is it? It's definitely not what I want. And I'm sure that people don't want to walk around harboring that in them, because it is definitely the source of inadequacy. If you want to feel inadequate on a day-to-day basis, if you want to feel like something is horribly and terribly wrong, and you don't know quite what it is you walking around harboring multiple distortions, or at least one major one that is spread. And if you think that isn't how it is, then I would just ask you to examine yourself and examine the world and conclude what you will. But Europe is in a strange place. I would rather have a sort of demographic leveling off. Actually, let's go further back. There was a time, let's say around the 1980s, 1990s, where the Western world realized it could move its factories and its means of production essentially to cheaper areas, Southeast Asia especially. And these companies could produce their goods somewhere else and sell them back in the host country far cheaper, which makes sense, in terms of business, just raw business, because the labor started to get too expensive in the United States, because you have all sorts of unions and all these crazy different things that we have out here that bring up the condition of the people. So you have to try to subvert that any way you can. And once the whole Chinese zone opened up, a lot of people were happy about that and parked their manufacturing in China. And after a period of time, the Chinese labor even started to get more expensive, as it does as a country develops. The condition of the people, quote unquote, at the bottom tends to rise. So, and simultaneously, China started to become a bit of an agitator globally. So, there's more than one reason why it became fashionable to leave China. And that's an ongoing situation, and it will continue to go on for some time as China becomes its own thing instead of a patchwork of international companies that it produces foreign exports into. But these Western countries realized we can keep the cheap labor if we import people who are low skilled and off the books in terms of citizenry. We can essentially have a form of slavery, which is a tragic statement if you're more liberally minded, because if you're more liberally minded these days, you're kind of more on the socialist end of things, And the ultimate irony is if you support this, you're directly supporting the worst impulses of capitalism, which is a term, like I said, that I don't like, but nonetheless, you're supporting the importing of cheap labor at the cost of the host population. I mean, at a dramatic cost as well, too, because this sort of distortion, this sort of immoral thing spreads into other things like any other distortion, even like an untrue thing. And it makes you wonder the true motivations of people who support such things, even if, it seems like maybe they know this or are aware of this or are able to conclude this, but it's the truth. So Europe went heavy into this, and they brought in people from all over the place. And Europe isn't the United States. It's just not. And the United States has gone through a lot to get where it even is today globally, as a place that people are probably the most inclined to assimilate into. Out of all the places on Earth, the U.S. is probably the one place where people are most likely to assimilate into once they get there. Because you can kind of be proud to be an American, even if that's a quick legal transition, and people will address you and think of you as such, but other places, it's not quite like that. And Europe is in multiple quagmires. I've always said that Europe should federalize, and people there should bite the bullet and pick a language, probably English, and just use it. There's almost like this pride thing where people want to hang on to their languages, which I do, trust me, I completely understand. But at the same time, objectively and practically speaking, it's a huge impediment toward unification for that continent, obviously. So somebody's got to bite the bullet out there if you want actual progress. It's like you've chosen something that isn't actual progress while thinking that it is, while the steps that you should take are obvious, So you end up with this EU thing that ends up being the worst of all worlds. It's not unifying, it ends up splintering up what are territories that are separate nations. I mean, imagine if the U.S. was a bunch of separate nations. It would be much worse. The fact that it's one country with individual states is hugely beneficial. But Europe remains separate countries without a military. And one of the main things that I've learned about watching Europe and even Australia and other, Western countries is the value of having your rights written down on paper that the military exists in part to defend. Like that alone is a very potent element in statecraft, state building. And what is equally as important is what is written on that document. So the ability to speak freely, simple, you know, not too controversial here in the United States. And the second being to arm yourself if you are so inclined. Those two things, it turns out, are vital. And if you don't have the second, like I always say, is the silent deterrent. A nation full of people with powerful weapons is quiet. It almost never speaks, but it's there, and everybody knows it. And whether we know it or not, or think it or not, it dictates our behavior, and it does restrain the tendencies of the government, which is a collection of people backed by law. And it's so ubiquitous in the United States, we don't even notice the pros and cons of that. You know, it takes a fairly astute observer to understand the benefits of something that's ubiquitous, that you never see, you know, a interval where you don't have it. You know, you have to use your, not only your imagination, but you have to use all known factors to inform that imagination. And you have to be able to do it well. But fortunately, I mean, we have Europe and other places, like I said, as an example, where 30 years ago they decided to make it basically illegal for the population to be armed. And since then, there has been the pretty clear will of the people. There's been a pretty clear set of beliefs and things that the people of Europe want, and the government has done explicitly the opposite. And it's almost like a mockery now. Like some of the stuff that I see there, it's almost like they're rubbing it in their faces, like there's nothing you can do about what's happening. And over and over and over again, there's more and more examples of this. And in the United States, you can't help but look on in horror because you kind of view Europe as a brother. It's like a brother that you want strong, you know? You want to be selfless, but also just as selfish as we are at the same time. Like there needs to be a balance of both. So don't disarm yourself, and don't allow yourself to be disarmed, because whatever people say that it's for pales in comparison to the ultimate truth, which is that it exists as a silent deterrent to keep people sovereign, a group of people sovereign, against an institution that's backed by law that has the same predilections as you and I, because it's people. That's the government doesn't suddenly make you sanitized and more moral because you enter it. You're still a person. I mean, it's almost like a trick of the mind or a trick of the campaigner to tempt you into thinking that by virtue of a person entering this position, this government position, that somehow they're always good and right and sure and up and will never not act on your behalf. That's a mistake. And that process can get worse over time. Like we're about, let's say, the second generation into a disarmed Europe. And it's just so much worse than the first generation. At least the first generation looked still like Europe and felt like Europe, you know, in terms of its global image and what actually happens there. But 2 generations in, it's pretty sad, to be honest. It's almost like Europe needs another renaissance. And if things continue on its current course, then the history books will probably note that World War II was too much of a psychic explosion, or too much of a psychic scarring for Europe to truly get past, because things that need to be done, decisions that need to be made, that are the case for the last like 20 years have been unable to come to pass because of the fear and the looming cloud of World War II and the events that led up to it. And one mustache man in particular, because it's even more of a horror show when one of the two political parties invokes that as part of their own selfish maintenance of their own position and their own ideas about what should happen in Europe. It's like a safeguard against the possibility of certain decisions being made. I mean, not anything extreme either. I'm talking just normal, sensible decisions that I think most people would agree should happen in a place. And it's led to this sort of emotional blackmailing of an entire continent, and it's even spread over to the United States sometimes. People invoke it as well. And then after people invoke it and things are fine, time goes on, nobody ever apologizes. Nobody ever says, I'm sorry, I said this about you, because saying that is actually a pretty terrible thing. And the implication is pretty terrible. And everybody just moves on, hoping that nobody mentions it, and time goes on and everything is just A-okay. It's this sort of toxicity and this sort of darkness I think people should be a bit more ashamed of, People say words are violence, people like to say stuff like that, but then they just say anything they want. And it comes out of the same mouth. It's a sword and a shield. It's a victim and an assaulter as well. And just moves right along and doesn't even bother to pay attention to what it does to the people in the area. And these people would also claim that they want to save the world and make the world a better place. Well, how can you even do that if you can't not be a dick? If you yourself as a human being can't not even not be a dick, how are you supposed to save the world? Those don't seem compatible. You yourself as a person aren't even capable of being decent, and you expect to save the world. I mean, it's just a staggering level of hubris and arrogance coming from people who would claim to not have those characteristics, who would actually claim and cast those characteristics onto whoever opposes them. And like I said, it's a failure of democracy to elect people who hate you, who make decisions that are actively against your interests. Objectively speaking, the United States, I love immigration. I love the fact that we have ended up kind of being the center of history, where the people of the world want to come here and be here and live and work and be Americans. That's fantastic. Let's keep doing that. But you have to do it legally. That there shouldn't be any other contention or any other interpretation on that. That's a simple, normal, reasonable thing to say. And if you try to intellectually wiggle your way out of that, I immediately suspect you for having some other motive. Because what's so wrong with that? And at least here in the U.S., like I said, we have some protection from the government. But Europe, man, you can scream that from the mountaintops, and you'll get abused, basically. And it's strange too, because my image of Europe kind of ended in the 90s, like when, there was the kind of cool Britannia thing when the British were still a massive cultural global force, which is not true anymore at all. The British are in a pretty tight spot, and I feel for them. They have a giant body of water between France and Britain, which is one of the best borders you could have. Yet still, they have some difficulty managing that. I would actually be more angry at France than anybody else for allowing that to happen. And it's like the states of Europe want to be unified, but they treat each other. It's almost like this sort of feline cat-like authoritarianism, where it claims to be something else and it isn't at all, or it's sort of very feline, but still nonetheless encroaches daily. And that's really going to be the question of the next 20 years as an observer. Are the people of Europe going to do something, Is the specter of World War II or the specter of whatever going to allow Europe to just continue to ruin itself? I mean, can we really even think of a world where Europe is a falling power like that, because the U.S. always needs at least one other very powerful partner, at least one. And, I mean, if it's not going to be Europe, it's going to be somebody else. It's almost like China is vying for that position. It plays a good enemy, and it has its issues for sure. Maybe some of which are even more dire than Europe's. But the U.S. is moving into a place where we don't care so much about your governing system. We don't care if you're a monarchy or a fucking dictatorship, as long as it appears as though you want to play ball. And as long as it appears as though you generally care about your population and you're acting on their behalf. Like, we'll do business with you. It kind of seems like, this is a strange era of like good dictators, if that even makes sense or is even possible for any extended period of time. Because as a human, as an American too, you kind of can't help but view a territory that has a leader for whom the public didn't choose as almost like a violation of the very existence of that public. But it seems like we're kind of getting past that because of the last 80 or so years of managing the world through an ideological lens as well. It's kind of like we're more willing to just be like, look, this is your culture, this is how you do it. We're not going to try to bring democracy out there and liberal values and all this stuff. Like, you want to play ball? Let's play ball. That type of thing. It's just kind of a more realpolitik view. And same as for Europe, man. Like Europe has some difficult decisions ahead, and there are people who are accurately diagnosing what's happening. And it's, among other things, been a catastrophic failure to understand what human beings are. Like, it is vital for leaders of places to know themselves and to know human beings and not to misunderstand, because it can truly lay out a distortion that can spread and build and bring actual suffering into the world. Like, that's part of what your main goal should be. Am I bringing suffering to my people? Like, it's a simple question, it's a simple aim. And decisions being made on that basis should be elementary. And then you have the Russia question, and it's easy to consider the whole western part of Russia as obviously European. And Russia to Europe is like Texas and the Dakotas and Alaska in terms of energy. Like, it's hard for Europe to, continue to move in a direction that might be considered progress without being directly tied to Russia. I mean, it's a strange arrangement that seems like it can't really continue in earnest. And Russia, I don't know what's going to happen after Vlad, but if I were them, I would view Western Russia as more European and Eastern Russia as more Asian, and connect the country, split it in half, and connect it where you need to connect it based off of geography, not off alliances and ideology. And Russia's big enough, like it's fucking huge. If you look at it on a map, the two corners of it, the bottom left and the bottom right corner, look like helmet straps hugging China. And, you know, going into the Caucasus, it's like, dude, you have so much territory, you're even slightly expanded into two separate continents. Like, you're good. You don't need Ukraine. Like, that's such a fool's errand, you know. You shouldn't even, Russia would be so much better off if they would have just, stayed under the radar in Ukraine and continued with gray zone activities and political activities and destabilizing activities, and slowly encroached and turned it into a sort of Russian peace over time, instead of using hard power and invading. That was so stupid, because you set yourself back so far, and now you have a little island launching drone attacks all over the western side, and reaching into some of the central part of your country day in and day out. Like, oops, like that was a fucking a gash that shouldn't even have happened, but it did. And, you know, I'm just one of those people who, while living in the U.S., yes, and wanting the U.S. to dominate the world, and wanting the U.S. to run the world, I also want other countries to do well, and I want them to want to dominate the world too. Like, for me, if you don't have that in you, then, you know, to me it's just I don't know, man. It's hard to view you as a place who is going to move humanity forward, even if you don't have that in you. And when I say dominate, I don't mean like with negative associations. I mean, I want some version of a moral domination, which is so tricky. Even just saying that out loud sounds strange. Some version of the world all playing games on each other, all playing a sort of geopolitical chess, vying for the top spot all the time, who are heavily interconnected and can pull this lever here and this lever there, who all need each other desperately, because that situation spanning across every conceivable area and sector in a country is what moves it forward. You know, we all have nukes here. We all have like massive militaries. Like the U.S., if it wanted to, could just go into South America, could go guns a-blazing anywhere it wants to, but that's not the kind of domination I'm talking about. And the U.S. doesn't even seek to be so dominant in a one-sided way that it shuts everybody out. Like, we need partners, and you know, there's always going to be aligned and unaligned interests. But I want to dominate, and I want everybody else to want to dominate, and that should be Europe as well. But Europe has to make some serious moves. Like, it needs to do something serious and quick. Because, again, whatever the U.S. is doing that's been so successful, you know, that sort of has taken over the world over the last 30 years, including culturally. You should want, but not literally, you know. Like, the U.S. is a special place, and its unique characteristics should generally try to be emulated, but not so literally. Like, you can't recreate the last 150 years of U.S. history in Europe. Like, you just can't do that. And why would you even want to do that? You know, it's not like it's easy. It's not like it's, you know, something so simple, mixing the people of Earth together in one place. It isn't just this kumbaya situation. It causes actual real scars and bumps and bruises. And if you're not a certain place, then you might not get out of it alive. You know, that there's more at stake than just having a sort of egalitarian, series of countries, or hyper progressive country. Like, you might actually not make it. And the people of the United States over the past 150, 200 years have generally all wanted to be Americans. We have our enclaves and we have our little splintered off areas. But at the end of the day, you know, people want to be Americans. But I don't know. I just genuinely believe that Europe needs some overarching state that the people can trust. That is an actual. But as I say that, I also realize at the same time, so much credit has been burned with the EU that it's going to be hard to even convince people that that's even possible. It's almost like it's already been squandered. It's, Europe had this golden opportunity, and they actually had it 30 years ago. They actually had it. If they had stayed the course, developing technology would have come along, and this importing cheap labor thing would have been completely unnecessary because of the advancing technology that's about to come. That's what makes it even worse. It's like our needs are going to be met in a lot of ways in the near future, not too distant future. And Europe has just shot itself in the foot over and over and over again for these short-term gains that aren't even gains. So, while it would be cool to have a United States of Europe and a single language and a single military, I don't even think the public has enough trust and goodwill towards such an institution anymore because of how bad it's been squandered. Which is depressing. So what then? What now? Part of the reason I say that I want such competition is because that's what Europe was for the last 2,000 years, 1,000 years, 1,500 years. It was all a bunch of separate nation states vying to be the dominating force. And none have really ever made it that far to where they completely dominated Europe and made it one state. A few places got kind of close, but it never fully happened, and it sort of hit the fast forward button for Europe and made it to where they could export themselves all over the world, and it put them ahead of everybody else. And they went about it with soft and hard power means. But the lesson from Europe is that hard power needs to exist. It needs to be kind of like a silent deterrent, kind of like the weapons of the people of the United States. But the main game is soft power. It's cultural, economic, technological. The military button should be there and a threat, but it shouldn't be something that you just use willy-nilly, because like the lesson learned from Russia going into Ukraine, Russia was thought to be the second most powerful military on earth. Like, they were this mythical kind of giant, post-Soviet Union, thinking that they were this behemoth, and they can't even, sweep through Ukraine without having some serious near state-ending incidences, and you can shatter the illusion very quickly by trying to make moves like that if you're not sure what you're doing. And, it's like it almost broke the illusion that we lived in a post-war era, which is so far from the truth, But the whole purpose of making this and saying this is that I would love to see a situation where the people of Europe wanted to dominate the world again. I want the people of Africa to want to dominate the world. People of the Middle East, people of China, everybody. because that's how you make alliances. That's how you know who your enemies are. That's how you keep going. It sounds like a negative word, but for human beings, it's actually a very strong driving force, and you can't just say because of World War II, I don't want to dominate. You know? And it's true that human consciousness has developed, simply by harboring knowledge and documenting and knowing a certain amount of things. It changes the way we go about certain things. It's okay to view this as a sort of global chess game, even though there's real consequences and costs. And again, when I say the word dominate, it doesn't have to be a dark term. It can be another term for being the sort of end-all be-all of decision making and a sort of moral center, which is something the United States has wanted to be for some time. But the way you maintain that is by properly making decisions on behalf of your people and being so good as to make proper decisions on behalf of others as well. And I say that wanting that for Europe.